6 men standing in a borrowed room with second-hand equipment and an idea so large that the people who heard it either laughed or went quiet. The kind of quiet that happens when someone says something so far beyond what circumstances allow that the only honest response is silence. Nobody funded them, nobody commissioned them, nobody in the institutional structure of the Philippine military looked at these 6 men in that borrowed room and saw what they claimed they were going to build. What those 6 men saw, clearly, without the distortion of doubt that practical people use to protect themselves from disappointment, was a special operations unit that the world would one day send its best soldiers to learn from. And they were right.
Understand what it means to build something from nothing inside a military institution, not from limited resources, from nothing. No dedicated facility, no established curriculum, no precedent to follow, no model to replicate, no senior officer with the authority and the vision to stand behind what they were attempting and absorb the institutional resistance that every genuinely new thing generates when it appears inside a system built to preserve what already exists. These 6 men had none of that. What they had was a shared understanding, arrived at independently and confirmed the first time they sat together in that borrowed room, that the Philippines had something the world's elite military programs had never accounted for, and that if nobody else was going to build a structure to express it, they would do it themselves.
The first year nearly ended it. Not because the training was wrong, or the concept was flawed, or the men themselves were insufficient for what they had committed to. It nearly ended because the world that surrounds a new thing, especially a new thing that has no powerful patron, no institutional endorsement, no budget line in any document that matters, applies a constant, patient, impersonal pressure that does not need to be hostile to be devastating. It simply needs to continue. Resources that were promised did not arrive. Space that was allocated was reallocated. Personnel who expressed interest were reassigned before they could contribute anything lasting. The 6 men absorbed every one of these setbacks with the particular, quiet stubbornness of people who have decided that the outcome is not negotiable, only the timeline. What they were building had a name inside their own conversations, long before it had a name in any official document. They called it, in the informal language of men who are too busy actually working to spend time on formality, simply the unit. Not our unit, not the unit we are building, the unit, as if it already existed in its final form, and they were simply the people responsible for closing the gap between what it currently was and what it had always been going to become. That quality of certainty, not arrogance, not bravado, but the settled, working certainty of people who have looked at a destination so many times that the distance between here and there has stopped feeling like an obstacle and started feeling like a schedule, was what the first recruits encountered when they arrived.
The first recruits were not what the 6 men had asked for. They never were in those early years. The Philippine military's personnel system operated on its own logic, its own priorities, its own assessment of where capable soldiers were most needed, and a brand new unit with no track record and no powerful advocate in the command structure was not at the top of that list. The men who arrived were solid, professional, competent in the ways that military service produces competence, reliable, disciplined, physically capable. What they were not when they arrived was what the unit needed them to become. That gap between competent and exceptional, between reliable and genuinely dangerous, was the first real test of whether what the 6 founders had built was a training program or a transformation. It was a transformation. The curriculum the 6 founders had developed over the unit's first year was not built from existing Philippine military doctrine. It was built from something more fundamental,
from a rigorous, unsentimental analysis of what elite special operations capability actually required, conducted by men who had studied every available model from every military tradition they could access, and then asked a question that most curriculum designers do not ask because the answer is too demanding. They asked, what would we need to do to produce soldiers that the world's best programs could not produce? Not match, not approximate, exceed. The answer to that question produced a curriculum that the first recruits described in the careful language of people who do not want to seem like they are complaining, as unlike anything they had experienced before.
The physical standards were not the hardest part. Physical standards, however demanding, are ultimately a negotiation between a body and its limits, a negotiation that sufficient motivation and sufficient time resolve in predictable ways. What the unit's curriculum demanded that went beyond physical standards was a quality that the 6 founders had identified in their analysis of elite programs as the single most consistent differentiator between special operations units that performed under real pressure and those that performed only under training conditions. They called it, in the internal language of the unit's early documents, adaptive intelligence, the ability to solve problems that had not been anticipated, in conditions that had not been simulated, with resources that had not been provided, against an adversary that was not cooperating with the scenario. They trained for it by creating training scenarios that had no correct answer, not difficult answers, no answers. Situations designed to be genuinely unsolvable by any single approach, where the measure of success was not whether the soldier found the solution, but whether he kept thinking clearly after it became obvious that the solution he had been trained for did not exist. It was, several of the early recruits said afterward, the most psychologically demanding thing they had ever been asked to do in uniform. Not the physical exhaustion, not the sleep deprivation, not the environmental exposure. The requirement to remain functional and decisive and forward-moving in the specific psychological state that human beings find most destabilizing. The state of not knowing what to do next and being responsible for figuring it out anyway. The unit's first external evaluation came 3 years after that initial meeting in the borrowed room, a bilateral exercise involving special operations units from 4 countries, an event that the unit's founders had been working towards since the beginning. Not because external validation was what they needed, but because external contact was what they needed. Because the only way to know whether what they had built was genuinely world-class or only excellent by local standards was to put it in direct contact with the world's standards and watch what happened. The founders had prepared their soldiers for this moment with a completeness that left nothing to chance and honesty that left nothing to illusion. They had told them exactly what they would face and exactly what was being asked of them. They had not told them to win, they had told them to be exactly what they were. What the other units encountered in that exercise was not what they had expected. The pre-exercise intelligence assessments, the professional evaluations that experienced special operations planners conduct before any joint event to identify threats, capabilities, and areas of concern, had placed the Philippine unit in a category that was respectful without being alarmed, capable, well-trained, worth watching. What the assessments had not captured, because the data available to produce them did not include what had happened inside that unit over 3 years of training that nobody outside the Philippines had been present for, was the particular quality that the curriculum had been specifically designed to produce. The quality that does not show up in any standard evaluation metric. The quality that only becomes visible when the scenario stops following the script. On the second day of the exercise, the script stopped following the script. A simulated scenario that had been designed with a specific solution pathway was disrupted by a weather event that altered the operational environment in ways the exercise planners had not accounted for. Most units, trained to execute planned solutions with precision and discipline, paused, reassessed, waited for updated guidance. The Philippine unit did not pause. They had trained for exactly this.
Not this specific disruption, but this specific type of disruption. The disruption that arrives without announcement and requires immediate adaptation without the comfort of a revised plan. They moved through the altered scenario with a fluency that the exercise observers noted in real time as something they had not seen before in units of equivalent size and resource profile.
The debrief after the exercise produced a document that circulated among the participating nations' special operations commands with a speed that classified documents rarely travel, which is to say quickly and widely among people with the clearance to read it and the professional context to understand what it meant. The document noted the Philippine unit's performance across 17 separate evaluation categories. In 11 of those categories, their scores placed them in the top tier of all participating units. In 3 categories, all 3 related to adaptive problem solving under disrupted conditions, their scores were the highest recorded in the exercise's history. The document's author, a senior special operations officer from one of the participating nations, added a single handwritten note in the margin of his personal copy. It said, "Find out how they train."
The answer to that question, how they trained, reached the Russian special operations community through the informal channels that military professionals use to share information that official channels move too slowly to carry. It reached them not as a report or an assessment, but as a conversation, the kind of conversation that happens between professionals who trust each other enough to say what the documents cannot. What it said, stripped of the careful language that formal communication requires, was simple. There is a unit in the Philippines that is doing something with adaptive training that we have not seen before, and the results are producing soldiers who perform differently under pressure than anything our current models explain. Someone needs to go there and understand it from the inside.
The first Russian special operations soldiers arrived at the unit's facility 18 months after that exercise, not as evaluators, not as observers conducting an assessment on behalf of their command, as students, a designation that Russian special operations personnel, among the most decorated and experienced in the world, do not accept lightly or without the complete conviction that what they are going to learn justifies the particular humility that the student position requires. They had read everything available about the unit. They had spoken with officers from the nations that had participated in the bilateral exercise. They had conducted their own analysis of the performance data, and they had concluded, with the professional rigor that serious military establishments apply to serious questions, that there was something here worth being a student for. The 6 founders were present when the Russian soldiers arrived. All 6 of them, some now in senior positions, some still in the roles they had occupied since the beginning, all of them carrying in their faces and their bearing the particular quality of people who have watched something they built with their hands become something the world takes seriously. They greeted the Russians with the professional courtesy that the occasion required and the quiet confidence that the occasion had earned. There was no ceremony about it, no speech, no formal acknowledgement of what the moment represented. A special operations unit built by 6 men in a borrowed room, now receiving students from one of the world's most formidable military traditions. The 6 founders simply showed them where to go, and the training began. The Russian soldiers went through the curriculum the way all serious students go through a curriculum that challenges their existing framework, with initial resistance, followed by the particular uncomfortable recalibration that happens when a framework that has served you well in every previous context encounters something it was not built to process. The adaptive training scenarios produced in them the same response they had produced in every previous cohort, the disorientation of competent people confronting problems their competence had not prepared them for. The difference was that the Russian soldiers, trained to the highest standards their system could produce, reached that disorientation faster and at a higher level than most previous cohorts, which meant the curriculum had to work harder, and working harder was exactly what the curriculum had been designed to do. 6 weeks into the program, one of the Russian soldiers, a decorated veteran of multiple operational deployments, whose record placed him among the most experienced men his unit had ever produced, said something during a debrief that the Filipino instructors present would remember with complete clarity for the rest of their careers. He said that in 20 years of special operations service, across deployments in some of the most demanding environments his country's military had ever operated in, he had been trained to solve problems. He said that what this curriculum was teaching him, for the first time at this point in his career, was how to think when the problem could not be solved.
He said the difference between those two things was larger than he had understood before he came here.
The program ran for 3 months. At its conclusion, the Russian soldiers departed with the formal professional courtesy that military exchanges require, and the less formal acknowledgement that happens in the spaces between protocol, in handshakes that last a moment longer than procedure requires, in the particular quality of eye contact between people who have been through something together that changed the way they understand their own profession. The unit's founders watched them go from the same facility that had once been borrowed space and second-hand equipment and an idea that made practical people go quiet. It was, by any measure that the world uses to assess such things, a long distance from where it had started. It was also, by the measure the founders had always used, exactly where it had always been going.
The 6 men who started this never sought recognition for what they built. That quality, the ability to work towards something significant without requiring the world to acknowledge the significance while the work is happening, is perhaps the most important characteristic they shared and the one most responsible for the outcome. Recognition, when it comes to people who built something without needing it, arrives differently than it arrives for people who built something in order to receive it. It arrives as confirmation rather than reward, as evidence rather than payment. The 6 founders had known what they were building from the first day in that borrowed room. The world's acknowledgement, when it finally came in the form of Russian special operations soldiers arriving as students, was not a surprise. It was simply the schedule, finally catching up. Somewhere in the Philippines tonight, that unit is still training. The borrowed room is long gone, replaced by a facility that reflects what the unit has become rather than what it started as. The second-hand equipment is long gone, replaced by tools that match the standard the curriculum demands. But the 6 men who built it from nothing carry something that no facility upgrade and no equipment replacement has changed. The knowledge that everything the world now sends its best soldiers to learn began with an idea so unreasonable that the only people who believed in it were the 6 people responsible for making it real. The world has a word for that. It calls it impossible. The Philippines has a different word. It calls it Tuesday.